Good evening. I have some news that will delight you. Murder is not dead. I do not refer to the ones splashed all over the front pages. Those are in such bad taste. I refer to those exquisite murders that have a touch of the bizarre and which take fiendish ingenuity to solve. Those are alive and well. One will be presented for your shivering delight immediately.
Is anything wrong?
Am I acting as if there's something wrong?
Hey! Your girlfriend stole $40,000.
Where are you going?
I'm looking for a private island.
You mean an institution? A madhouse?
There are plenty of motels in this area.
She spent last Saturday night at the Bates Motel.
We just keep on lighting the lights and following the formalities.
Isn't this the first place that looks like it's hiding from the world?
I'm sure there's something wrong out there, and I have to know what.
My mother, she isn't quite herself today.
Norman Bates' mother has been dead and buried in Green Lawn Cemetery for the past 10 years.
I declare.
Don't you touch me! Don't! Put me down!
I don't like you going to that house alone.
I can handle a sick old woman.
It's not as if she were a maniac. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
We were on North by Northwest, and we weren't looking for the next one particularly. And it wasn't until we finished shooting and we were preparing for post-production, and Hitch would read the New York Times book section he'd read it over the weekend or bring it into the office on Monday. And we saw this very good review by Boucher on this book, Psycho. So Hitch said, call Paramount and get coverage on it. Well, Paramount hadn't covered it. And Hitch went over to England, and as he was at the airport, he saw the shelves of this book, Psycho. So he called me and said, haven't you got coverage from Paramount yet? And I said, no, Paramount didn't cover it. So he said, all right. He got the book, and he read it going over, and he called back from London to say, I got our next subject, Psycho.
It's a much more violent book than it is a movie. You know, the girl gets beheaded in the shower as opposed to simply stabbed to death. But the book is mild by comparison with the facts of Ed Gein. This is one of those series of murders that so shocked the nation that it became part of American mythology. And, you know, we weren't around in 1960, so it's hard to know how the facts impacted the fiction. But one's got to assume that one of the reasons why both the book and the movie are so successful is because people knew that, albeit remotely, they were based on truth. The contemporary accounts speak of the police, who I think were a tough bunch of people, still being totally appalled at what they found inside. Here's a guy out in Wisconsin, the wilds of Wisconsin, who does in a whole bunch of his neighbors and his mother. And, you know, these were innocent women who had committed no crime against this man whatsoever. They were just, you know, happened to be his neighbors. I mean, this was obviously a crazy, sad man, and who became a piece of American mythology, I think. And he is the underpinning of Bloch's book, but he obviously is there, we say this, in spirit, in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre pictures, and arguably in Silence of the Lambs. What I think the movie does spectacularly well and perversely is bring a curious glamour to the character of Norman Bates. In the book, he's this pudgy, rather, you know, nondescript, short, balding man. And of course, in the movie, it's one of the great performances of cinema. And one of the defining, actually the defining performance of Anthony Perkins' career, and one of those performances everybody knows, even if you've never seen the movie. I mean, it's just, everybody knows Norman Bates.
It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
We were looking for a writer, and someone suggested James Kavanagh, who wrote some of the Alfred Hitchcock Presents, the television shows. Now, I don't remember the meetings that they had, but when we got the treatment, we read it, And it was very dull. If you can imagine a dull script written from the book of Psycho, it just didn't have anything. So then it was decided, well, we need another writer. Who we're going to get? And then names are suggested, and Hitch thought a lot of Ned Brown, and Ned suggested Joseph Stefano.
My involvement with Psycho began through my agent, Ned Brown, who was determined that I should work with Hitchcock. And Hitchcock had seen the two things that I had done prior to that and wasn't terribly impressed with them, and also didn't care too much to work with young, new writers. So Ned persisted, and Mr. Hitchcock gave in. When I met Mr. Hitchcock at my first meeting, I had to convince him that I could write this movie. And I felt that the best way to do it would be to simultaneously interest him in how I saw it being done and solve the main problem of the material, which was a boy with a dead mother, and we weren't supposed to know she was dead. So I conceived of the story being about Marion, lovely young lady who's having a disastrous affair with a man who can't marry her. She's a rather moral girl. She wants to get married, and she says, we can't meet in hotel rooms anymore. We're not going to do this. And he kind of laughs it off almost. He doesn't really believe her. And this only heightens her frustration. When she gets back to the office, she suddenly has a large sum of money in cash in her hand, and in a moment of madness decides to steal it. So she steals it and is going to go to her boyfriend and give it to him, which in itself is a preposterous notion that he would accept it. And she drives and gets lost in a rainstorm and then finds the motel and goes into the motel and talks to the young man who runs the motel and begins to realize that he's in a trap and she has just put herself in a trap and that she's got to get out of it. And she decides to return the money, and she feels good about this, and she takes a very cleansing shower, and someone comes in and murders her. And at that moment, Hitch said we could get a star to play that part. And I knew I had a job, because he liked that whole introduction to the movie. He liked the fact that it was going to be about her. And then we were suddenly going to do this awful thing to you and say, no, 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 it's not about her, it's about him. My first meeting with Hitchcock took place at his offices at Paramount Studios. Psycho was a Paramount picture. And he was, as always, as I would soon be learning, immaculately dressed, dark suit, white shirt, beautiful tie, sat behind his desk, rarely moved away from his desk, and very warm. I found coming from him a kind of warmth that was not that common amongst directors in those days, nor is it today. But it was a wonderful, wonderful kind of rapport. And his interests were charming. He asked me things about myself. I told him that I was in analysis, and that, as a matter of fact, I had just come from a session with my analyst, and he was very, very curious about that, but always in a very polite way, but he truly wanted to know what was going on. And I thought that he probably felt that there was more to writing a movie than simply talking about the movie, and I was right. The next day, after the first meeting, we began talking about this movie that we were going to make, called Psycho. We never mentioned the book again, and we never referred to the book again. And there's never any talk about dialogue or motivation. The thing that was a little bit scary at that point in my life about the way Hitchcock worked was that he would not discuss motivations and characters and why people were doing it. He felt that was my job. If I asked him any kind of question like that, he would say, well, that's up to you, Joseph. And I realized early on that he had faith in the writer or he did not have faith. And if he didn't, I don't think you'd be working with him. And he did an interesting thing, though, which kind of amused me and touched me. After we had been talking daily for about a week and a half, he said that he and his wife were taking a cruise. And he said, while I'm gone, why don't you write that first scene in the hotel room? And I said, fine, I'll do that. And I wrote it, and when he came back, we resumed our meetings, and I gave him the scene. And the next morning, he said to me, Alma loved it. And I was very touched, because obviously he liked it too, but it was lovely of him to tell me how his wife felt about it, because that was a little easier for him to do. He was not a sentimental man. Or he was, but would not show it, let's put it that way.
My mother was the one who really, you know, was in on everything from the very, very beginning. When he would find a story that he was anxious to do, he would have her read it. If she didn't think it would make a picture, he didn't touch it. And then she would be the first one to read the treatment and the screenplay, and she was, you know, even in on a lot of the casting, too. And it was wonderful. When she died, Charles Chaplin of the Los Angeles Times said the Hitchcock touch had 4 hands and 2 of them were Alma's.
She used to come to the office quite often when we were working on it. And one day was a very, very terrifying experience when we were working on Psycho. In my very first meeting with Hitchcock, he said, this is going to be a black and white movie, and it's going to cost under $1 million. And I was flabbergasted because I had never conceived of Hitchcock at that point in his life making a movie for less than $1 million.
That's exactly what he wanted to do. He said, first of all, I cannot make this picture in color because it will be too gory. And he said, secondly, I want to make it as simply, for as little money as possible, and I'm going to use the TV crew. And that's what he did. He used the crew that was working on his show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and he used them for Psycho.
And he mentioned another company that was making very low-budget movies, which were not terribly good, and were doing very well at the box office. And his feeling was, how would it be if somebody good did one of these low-budget movies?
I think Mr. Hitchcock was at the end of his contract with Paramount, and he had already moved to Universal. And I don't think they were pleased with that idea. I don't think they had a great deal of interest in a low-budget film, especially when he had gone to MGM and done North by Northwest, and now he was at Universal. And this was, I think, the last of his contractual obligation to Paramount. So Psycho was a unique motion picture in the fact that it was a Paramount release, a Shamley production made at Universal Studios. Shamley Productions was owned outright by Mr. Hitchcock.
In the book, Norman Bates is actually a middle-aged man, a reprobate, drinks, overweight, wears big thick glasses, peeps through holes. I thought he was incredibly unsympathetic. I didn't like him. So when Marion gets killed, I am then expected to switch my empathy toward this man, and I couldn't do it with the character as he was written. So I perceived, what would you think of Tony Perkins? And of course, that was practically what I had described. Once I had written the first draft, which incidentally is the one that he shot. He told me that Anthony Perkins was available to play Norman Bates. I had told him that was sensational, and that was what was going to happen. He mentioned Janet Leigh for the star part because he felt, among other things, that no one would be able to accept that we had killed her this early in the movie.
The first thing that happened was that I received the novel by Robert Bloch from Mr. Hitchcock. He sent me this small novel with a note that said, please consider the role of Mary. It was Mary in the novel. And of course, there will be changes. And so you know, Anthony Perkins is going to play Norman Bates. And he said, you know, the script has not been written, but so you know what the essence of the story is. Well, when I received this, I didn't even have to read it, but I did. only because the opportunity of working with Mr. Hitchcock was enough for me. But I dutifully read it, as I was supposed to, and I finished it. I was very intrigued. I mean, it was so different. It was such a departure, and such an unusual approach to a movie. And so, of course, I just said yes. I have been asked subsequently, well, didn't it ever bother you that the role of Marion in the script was ended so abruptly? And it never did. It never occurred to me that would be a problem. I mean, that didn't even enter my head. The whole thing that I concentrated on was, one, working with Mr. Hitchcock, and two, the anticipation of what was he going to do with this. I couldn't wait to see how he would solve this and weave his magic spell and get this project to the public. As it was getting closer, Mr. Hitchcock called and asked, if we could have a meeting. I said, of course, for several reasons. One, he wanted to, to sort of have a discussion about his modus operandi. I mean, how he worked on the set and how he used his camera. Explained to me how his camera was absolute, and that as a director, he had confidence that I would bring to Marion what it needed. If I had any problems, by all means, he would be there to help me if I, should need it. He said the only sort of control is that my camera had
to be kept secret, that the fun of it, the magic of it would exist in your not knowing the truth about the story. Up until the last moment, you had to believe that the mother was alive. Therefore, didn't want me to discuss the script with anybody. Didn't want anybody talking about it. I don't think many people knew what we were doing, really. My friends knew I was working on a movie with Hitchcock, but they didn't know what it was. Had no visitors on the set. It was a very closed shop, and that was the way he wanted it. And he decided that if he spread some rumors about casting the mother in the movie, this would simply solidify it, certainly amongst the Hollywood people. And they were the ones he was most worried about. Because if they knew what the story was about, then the public would find out. So he did get word around that he was looking for someone to play Anthony Perkins' mother, and the agents piled on with their suggestions, So it was a hoax that worked to the benefit of the picture, I think, and to the benefit of the audience who would ultimately be seeing it.
Psycho was shot mainly on the back lot of Universal. Originally, he wanted the opening shot to be a helicopter shot. Hitchcock was always ahead of his time in the type of shots he wanted to get. And at that time, he wanted a helicopter to come in with the city of Phoenix in the far background and just titles over this slow-moving move-in shot, move-in shot, move-in shot to a hotel. I think it was on Adams Street in Phoenix. And go through the window and discover John Gavin and Janet Leigh in a hotel room to open his movie. And we tried and we tried and we tried, and it was just for title shots, it was just too jerky and bumpy and moving. And it was before the mounts, the camera mounts that you have today and all of that. We didn't have that, and we couldn't do it.
True gentleman, a wonderful man, and a very decent and sort of honorable, So to do the opening scene, and I hadn't known John Gavin well. I'd met him, but to start off with this kind of a scene, the first day of shooting was I think, awkward. And so we did the scene, and Mr. Hitchcock was not pleased. And so he kind of took me aside, and he said, Janet, do you think, I'm not quite getting the passion that I think should come across for this scene. Do you think you could, do something? And I said, well, I'll do my best. And so I did.
Hitchcock's only reference to his cameo in Psycho came early on in our work on the movie, where he said, actually what he said to me was, you may know, Joseph, that I always appear in one scene in my movies. And I said, yes, I think I noticed that. And he said, I'm going to have to do it early in this one. And he was absolutely right, because once you got to that murder scene, any interruption by seeing Hitchcock on screen would have been disastrous.
It got to be a very, very hard thing. It started through a thing of necessity in silent movies when you needed people in it, and so everybody on the set would go in it. And then because he was so, different looking and rather rotund, people started recognizing him. And then it started becoming very, very difficult, because especially after the TV show, when he got to be so well known.
Good evening.
And then people would see it and say, oh, there he is, or they would wait and look. So he had to do it usually at the very beginning of a movie, before he was creating any mood or, anything like that. And it did get to be rather hard for him to do it.
So he decided to do it outside the place where Marion worked. So with the part that Pat Hitchcock played and her line.
Any calls?
Teddy called me. My mother called to see if Teddy called.
So this intertwining of people and their attachment to the mother was very important. I had even tried that in a line in my own first draft, not the one I gave to Hitchcock. I had even tried to work that into the man with the money, the man with the $40,000. And it sounded like then I was hitting one note too heavily. So I just let it go at that. But the whole point of it was to say Mother somehow is always there, and it made her alive.
My mother, what is the phrase? She isn't quite herself today.
So a lot of the lines in the early scenes were designed to keep you from thinking, why aren't we seeing her?
I think the wonderful thing about Mr. Hitchcock's approach to movies, and his movies obviously exemplified that, is the bait that he gives us, and certain themes that he carries through in his movies. There was always a connection between food and death, and food and sex, and it was always put out there.
You never did eat your lunch, did you?
You eat like a bird.
You'd know, of course.
Food in Mr. Hitchcock's pictures were always very important, and going back to many of his movies, you'll find that there was a correlation with food in some part of the plot.
Well, the corpse was deep in rigor mortis. He had to break the fingers of the right hand to retrieve what they held. It would be so nice to get back to plain bread in this house.
A few years ago, Mother met this man.
He interwove eating scenes or discussing it with what was going on the screen.
And the way he died. I guess it's nothing to talk about while you're eating.
There's also Tony Perkins, and it was his idea, I believe, of the Halloween candy that he was always eating throughout the movie.
No storyboard on it when I wrote it. I just described the fact that she gets into the shower and then someone comes in with a knife and kills her. In the book, it says that her head was cut off. And I wrote enough in my description of the murder scene to make sure that no one thought we were going to cut Janet Leigh's head off. And I don't think that Hitchcock ever really imagined that. But Hitch had very strong ideas about that scene. So at that point, Saul Bass came in and did a storyboard on it.
Over the years, this rumor sprung up that Saul Bass had directed the shower scene.
I have heard that Saul Bass said he directed the shower scene, that he was the one that physically directed it. I want to put that to rest right now. I was on the set every second of every foot of film that was shot on Psycho, and Mr. Bass never directed a scene in that motion picture. Mr. Hitchcock directed every scene in that picture.
Mr. Bass got full credit for what he did, and what he did was brilliant. I mean, his storyboard, I mean, his drawings of how he thought the showers should, you know, the angle. What Mr. Hitchcock, they conferred, and he said, show me what it's going to look like from this angle, and from this, and from that, because what I want to do is make a montage. Show me what it's going to look like so I can get in my mind the flash cuts. And he drew them very beautifully and graphically. Also, his titles were wonderful. But to say that he directed it, I tell you that no one directed that scene except Mr. Hitchcock.
The famous shower sequence of Psycho was shot on a set that was no more than 12 by 12, 12 feet by 12 feet. It was a very small, confined set.
The shower sequence took up 1/3 of my shooting time, actually. I mean, I think I worked 3 weeks on the movie, and the shower sequence took 7 days, 7 shooting days. So that was a good hunk of of my work.
For the assistant director, who was kind of in charge of the schedule and the time and the hours, et cetera, the number of shots we had to do in there, and they weren't difficult for Mr. Hitchcock to direct and to take time. Once we rolled the cameras, it was a matter of seconds of getting the shot. It was up to Jack Russell, the cinematographer, to light each setup and to move the camera around from shooting straight down to straight up to cross angles to into the water. I mean, it was tedious for him and the time that it took to light. And then, of course, we had to have the warm water because we kept running out of that. We had tanks and had to heat them and keep them heated. There were many things we had to do that were behind the scenes. The actual shooting was easy. The water coming out of the shower head was a special rig. And it was made up in the special effects department. It was shot straight at the lens, and the camera was tilted at such an angle that the water never touched the lens. It was, today they've got ways of wiping the water and cleaning it that you don't know. But this was a special shower head. We were one of the first to ever work with a nude photo double, and that was all a secret and a hush-hush thing, and there were signs on the door, and we never allowed a visitor or anything in.
Hitchcock wanted a nude model because he felt that a person who was naked professionally would be easier to deal with than an actress who had no experience being naked in front of hundreds of people. And he brought in a nude model, very nice young lady. It was quite charming to see the two of them standing there talking. Hitchcock here and the naked girl there.
There was a nude model, absolutely, because for several reasons. One, he had to see what density of water and the shower curtain so that you couldn't see whether someone was nude or not. And you can't tell that unless you see someone nude, to know when to cut it off. You know, where you don't see it, where you think what you see, but you don't see it.
Mr. Hitchcock felt that through the shower curtain, the effect of a nude, if they had a stocking or whatever on, that it wouldn't be the same.
Also, there was a scene where he drags the body, wraps the body in the curtain, and then takes it to the car. And I did not do that. I don't know how many times Hilton Green and I tried to remember the exact number of what take it was, but we know it was in the 20s. Contrary to what some of the dialogue is on the Universal tour, sometimes they say that Mr. Hitchcock turned cold water on me in the shower so that I would scream, you know. Well, that's exactly the opposite. He was so considerate of the temperature of the water that I would be comfortable, to the point where it almost caused a problem, because in this scene, I'm draped down with the head in position, and it's very uncomfortable, and the eye, and you know, it's all, very, and the difficulties technically. Anyway, finally we're getting something going. It seems to be going right. I didn't blow it. The focus was going right, and the steam from the water had gotten to the moleskin. Now, I could feel the moleskin pulling away from my top part. And so I could feel this. It was just kind of like going, and I thought, you know what? I don't want to do this damn thing again. I really don't want to. And all the guys on the scaffolding, I think they had double duty up there, quite frankly. But anyway, so be it. But there were a lot of guys on the electricians up on the scaffolding. And you couldn't, I knew the camera couldn't see it because I was over the top. I knew the camera couldn't see it from the angle that I was. But I knew that they would get an eyeful. And I said, I'm not going to be modest, you know, let them look, because I'm not going to stop this shot. I am not going to stop this shot. And I didn't, and they did.
Tony Perkins at that time was in New York and was not present at all during that entire week that we shot the shower scene.
There was no need for him to be there because Tony Perkins wasn't there, Mother was there. And Mr. Hitchcock had several people be Mother. He had his stand-in play Mother at one point. He had a woman play Mother at one point.
No! George would come down and just check in with him daily, and Mr. H would want to know how things were going, and he'd say, fine, I have some film for you to see at noon. Mr. Hitchcock would never stay at night. He never wanted to work past 6 o'clock, ever. Sometimes we had to go till 6:30, 6:45, but no, I mean, he just didn't believe in that. He believed in getting his day's work and going home. So George would run film with him at lunchtime. We didn't run dailies with Mr. Hitchcock. The crew ran dailies at the end of the day. So he would see them at noon and we would see them that night. If there was something wrong, we knew about it immediately right after lunch.
Hitchcock told me shortly after they started shooting that the movie was going to be too long, and that he said we could go two ways: remove one whole scene or chop down other scenes. So I said, I hate to lose any scene in the movie, so I made little marks around parts of scenes where I thought we could lose quarter of a page, third of a page, and that it would all add up. And unfortunately, it didn't. They still wanted more cut. So he felt that the only scene in the movie that wasn't absolutely necessary to the story was a scene between Lila and Sam where they both realized that they've lost someone that they love. And it was an emotional scene, and I felt very important to those characters. But it was also, story-wise, the only one that we could lose. And as Hitch said, I think that you feel that they know they've lost somebody they love. The scene is nice, but that's the one that can go. So that got cut. I don't think it ever got shot.
The fascinating part, which my father loved from the very beginning, was having Janet play that part, and then she's out, you know, first quarter of the movie.
One day we'd finished shooting, and Hitch said, you know, people who come in late to see Psycho will wonder, where's Janet Leigh? And they'll keep on waiting for her, and she'll be dead, and they won't know it. Well, what can be done about it? So he thought, while we were talking, and he said, you shouldn't allow people into the theatre after the film has started. They'll see Janet will be orderly and everyone will realize it. So I laughed. I didn't think it would be possible to tell theatre managers when to show the picture and when not to. And He convinced Paramount, publicity, this was the way to start it, and the whole ball started rolling then. And it was successful because the theatre managers cooperated.
No one, but no one, will be admitted to the theater after the start of each performance of Psycho.
It was a great gimmick, if you want to call it a gimmick, because that the people had to get in and get down before the picture started, and that brought them in, and then when they left screaming and some people and running out and during the scene, especially during the shower scene, which just added to the enthusiasm of the public wanting to see this picture.
Do not expect to be admitted into the theater after the start of each performance of the picture. We say no one, and we mean no one. Not even the manager's brother, the President of the United States, or the Queen of England. God bless her.
In New York, some journalists thought, well, we'll catch them out, we'll show this is just a publicity stunt. So they got hold of a woman who was pregnant and coached her what to say to the manager and with her so-called husband. He went in and he said, look, my wife is pregnant, you can see, and but she wants to see Psycho. Let us in, now the picture started, please. So the manager said, well, I'm very happy for you that she's pregnant, sir, but we can't allow her in the theatre. She's perfectly welcome to sit in my office until the next program starts, but can't come in the middle of the program. And that was true. They carried it out, and of course you had long lines photographed by people waiting to get in who weren't allowed in, which was very good.
Good afternoon. Here we have a quiet little motel.
The trailer for Psycho was done when we finished shooting. All the sets were saved and held on the stage, and we were all called back, I don't know, I think it was about a week later. And we spent one day, and it was a fun day because the strain of the movie was over. The schedule was done, and it was all in the can. And it was, looking back on that day, it was like a party day with Mr. H.
Of course, in a flash, there was the knife, and in no time, the victim tumbled and fell with a horrible crash. I think the back broke immediately and hit the floor. It's difficult to describe the way that the twisting of the. Well, I won't dwell upon it.
Talking of coming up with the idea for the trailer, doing a tour of the house and all this, that was Hitch's own idea, and also to treat it in a very droll fashion. Oh, look! I can't tell you what went on in this place. It's too terrible. This is where she. No.
This picture.
Terribly funny.
Has great significance because let's go along to cabin number 1.
When Hitchcock walks in and pulls the shower curtain away and reveals Vera Miles behind there instead of Janet Leigh, it was part of the fun that went on that day. Well, the release of Psycho was not critically acclaimed. In fact, the critics didn't, they poo-hooed it. They didn't think this was up to the standard of North by Northwest or To Catch a Thief or Vertigo or all the famous Hitchcock pictures.
I think the critics didn't like being made to see it in a theater. That pissed them off. They wanted to see it in the screening room like they always did, all by themselves or with their secretaries. And Mr. Hitchcock said no previews. And as a matter of fact, the critics had to see it on the day that it opened with the ordinary folk. And I'm convinced that we got a lot of bad reviews because of that. I think they were kind of irritated reviews. You could almost feel the irritation.
He was disappointed when a movie didn't get good reviews, because he knew how much time he'd spent on it, And he'd been, I think he'd been a little spoiled very early on when he came here, when he had such great reviews, you know, for Rebecca and some of the others, Suspicion, you know. And I think that's, it bothered him.
Bosley Crowther of the New York Times said it was awful, and then later in the year picked it as one of the 10 best pictures of the year. And it was curious, just the audience seemed to like it.
The audience for Hitch were the most important part of the movie making. On Psycho, he'd send me out to the different theaters to check with the manager. How did the audience go for this or that? What were the reactions as the audience came out of the theater? And I know that on Psycho, I said to him that the reactions were the same. It was that the audience would come out laughing in horror, like on a roller coaster. You see, and they came out, and in all theaters they did that. They came up with a sense of tremendous enjoyment. This was a lovely evening they'd had watching these murders, and that's what mattered to him, to get the audience involved.
While I was writing it, it never occurred to me that an audience would yell at the screen, "Don't go down there," or give any kind of aid or comfort to the victims. And it was remarkable. When I saw it the first time in a theater, my wife and I took several friends to see it, because we couldn't take them to a screening, as most people do. So we took them to the theater, and I saw it completely with titles and everything at the same time that the audience was seeing it. And I was shocked, absolutely shocked. Could not believe that the audience would react like this. This felt like when I was a kid and watched serials on Saturday afternoon, and we yelled at the screen. But these were grown-ups doing it.
I feel very strongly that the reason that Psycho has endured is because of the restrictions that were put on us, and because Mr. Hitchcock had to come up with a suspense story without showing what, you know, today is normal. He allowed the audience to create what they thought they saw. And when the audience becomes a part of the creative process, they're not going to forget that.
And I think that's why his pictures are lasting today, because they weren't made for critics. You know, I'm sure he would love to have critical acclaim and all that, but he makes them for the audience.